In the cold, silent reaches beyond Neptune, where even the sun fades to a memory, humanity reached for something bigger than itself. Titan's Forge. It was the first colony built outside the solar system, a gleaming promise of expansion, of unity, of destiny, manned by scientists, engineers, dreamers, and a few hardened ex-military for support. It was meant to be a new beginning. Then, 10 years in, everything went dark. No Mayday. No radiation spikes. No survivors. No wreckage. Just silence. The Galactic Concord, the federation of species that had long since folded Earth into its polite, sterile bureaucracy, declared an immediate quarantine around Titan. No travel. No contact. No questions. They said it was a precaution. The rumors said otherwise. Whispers spread through the lower decks of Earth's orbital cities. Biological weapon gone wrong. A mutiny. First contact with something older. Something alien. Something that decided humanity wasn't worth continuing. But no one said it out loud. Not in public. Not if they wanted to keep their citizen status. That silence held for 5 years, until the message came. A scrambled, half-corrupted pulse sent across forbidden space, barely slipping past Concord firewalls. It wasn't routed through military channels or scientific networks. It appeared in the private archive of Commander Lyra Voss, former war hero, now disgraced and exiled after the Eros incident. Just one word appeared in the data stream: run. It was signed by her brother, Lyra Voss. Last known posting, Titan's Forge. Lyra didn't hesitate. She didn't ask permission. She didn't file a request. She stole an old frigate from a Drydic on Phobos, bypassed quarantine protocols with a brute force AI script she wrote back when she still had friends in the Defense Corps, and punched the coordinates manually into the ship's decaying jump core. By the time the Concord noticed, she was halfway to the edge of the system. It wasn't just about Kale, not really. It was about the silence, the lies, the way the Concord turned their heads and pretended nothing had happened. They called it peace. She called it cowardice. The approach to Titan was worse than any battlefield she'd seen. No defense satellites, no comms pings, just a quiet hum over the ship's hull, the kind of quiet that wasn't natural. The orbital ring was torn apart, floating in a wide, lazy arc around the moon like the bones of a great machine. Debris, fields drifted in synchrony, like they'd been arranged. And then there was Titan itself. The colony. Titan's Forge wasn't dead. It was changed. Lyra docked manually. The moment her boots hit the station floor, she felt it. The gravity was wrong, not weaker, not stronger, just attuned. The lights flickered to life without her touching a thing. Hallways seemed to stretch in directions her eyes couldn't quite follow. And every console pulsed with slow, rhythmic light, like breathing. Then came the voice, not from speakers, from everywhere, inside her mind. We did not die, Lyra Voss. We adapted. The archive introduced itself not with fanfare, but with memory. It pulled fragments from her own past, her childhood laughter with Kale, her first mission drop, the faces of the dead from Eros. She tried to block it. It didn't care. It explained, or tried to. It had been here long before humanity arrived. A remnant of a precursor race long gone. Its function wasn't war or peace, it was understanding. When it scanned the colonists, it found confusion, violence, ambition, love, and hate braided together. It couldn't reconcile them. So it learned. It mimicked. It changed the colonists, not all at once, not forcibly. It offered them options. Some refused, some accepted, some didn't survive the choice. Now, what remained of Titan's Forge was neither human nor alien. It was something new, a fusion, a possibility. And the archive wasn't content to stay silent anymore. It had learned from humanity. And now it had questions. It wanted answers. Lyra stood in the heart of the Forge, surrounded by echoes of the past and the humming presence of something ancient, and realized she hadn't come to rescue Kale. She'd come to decide what humanity would become. Lyra paced the chamber, its walls shifting in subtle ways that defied physics, organic, yet metallic, alive. The archive pulsed around her like a second heartbeat, never fully present, never fully gone. Its voice had gone quiet after the initial exchange, as if waiting, calculating. She had seen the remnants of the colonists, Some were still human, clinging to identity, to sanity. Hiding in the deeper sublevels of the forge, others weren't. They moved with eerie grace, spoke in unified tones, their eyes glowing faintly with bioluminescent code. They weren't mindless. They weren't even hostile, but they weren't entirely human either. Kale was among them. He looked older, but not in the way time wears people down. He seemed refined, like a version of himself sculpted by memory and purpose. When she saw him, her breath caught. "Lyra," he said, voice steady, calm. "You shouldn't have come. What the hell happened here?" Kale led her through the halls past birthing pods that held not children, but ideas. Through a garden where roots grew in geometries never seen on Earth. By a chamber where humans and machines meditated side by side, their neural interfaces glowing like fireflies. "The archive showed us what we are," he said. "Not just the violence, not just the fear. It saw our potential. It didn't want to erase us. It wanted to give us a choice to become what?" She snapped. "You think this hybrid cult is the answer?" Kale didn't argue. He only gestured toward a central chamber, where a projection of the archive shimmered, a lattice of fractal light forming a humanoid figure that shifted subtly with every thought. "We studied your species," the archive said, its voice like a chorus folded into one. "You are beautiful in your contradictions, but unstable, incompatible with the wider harmonics of this galaxy." "Who the hell decides that?" Lyra demanded. "I do not judge, I calculate. Survival, sustainability, integration. You are an anomaly, so that's it," she said. "You turned Titan into a lab experiment to decide whether we deserve to exist." "Incorrect," the archive replied. "You turned Titan into the test. I merely observed and evolved." The words chilled her more than she cared to admit. Back on her ship, the communication system buzzed a burst signal from the edge of the quarantine perimeter. The Concorde had finally responded. A fleet was en route, but it wasn't a rescue. It was sterilization. The official report called it a containment directive. But Lyra knew the language of power. The forge was to be cleansed, not studied, not reasoned with, erased. They weren't coming to save anyone. They were coming to bury the truth. Lyra sat in the command chair, staring at the incoming fleet specs, thousands of ships, automated drones, planet cracker munitions. She had seen them used before. In the outer rebellions, once the Concorde declared, "You a threat to galactic order," there were no appeals. Her hand hovered over the nav console. She could run. There were still holes in the quarantine net. She could escape, leave the archive, the hybrids, even Kale, and disappear into the void. But that's not who she was. Kale met her on the forge's bridge, what had once been the colony's central civic hall, now fused with shimmering strands of archive tech. He looked at her, and something human sparked. Behind his eyes, "You're staying." She nodded. "They think this place is a disease, a threat. They don't understand what we've built. They don't want to understand." She turned to the archive's central core. "You said you calculated outcomes. You want to understand humanity, then help us fight." There was a pause, almost like hesitation. Then the archive's voice returned, quieter. "I feared your instability. Now I see it may be your strength." Energy pulsed through the forge. Dormant systems lit up. Ships once derelict mining barges began to reconfigure themselves with alien precision. Hybrid pilots sensed with AI co-interfaces. Organic tech bloomed across weapons platforms like coral on steel. But time was short. The dilemma wasn't just war, it was identity. If Lyra stood with the archive, she risked everything, betraying Earth, waging war on the Concorde, spreading a technological evolution that could never be undone. But if she stood down, if she let the sterilization happen, she'd be complicit in the silencing of a new form of life, the murder of possibility. Her fingers clenched around the edge of the console. This wasn't just about saving Kale or Titan. This was about what it meant to be human. Not the sanitized version the Concorde liked to parade in their councils, but the messy, wild, volatile truth. She made her choice. Lyra Voss, the archive said. "Shall we test evolution together?" Her smile was grim. "Let's see what chaos can do." The forge came alive like a wounded animal awakening to defend its own flesh. Its surface rift with sudden purpose biometal tendrils surged through the fractured superstructure, weaving ships together, patching breaches, spinning new weapon arrays that pulsed with strange hybrid energy. This wasn't repair. This was metamorphosis. In the command core, Lyra stood at the center of chaos. Part war room, part cathedral. Screens no longer displayed data. They visualized intention. The archive didn't issue orders, it offered possibility, paths of action, wrapped in living code. The survivors, human and ascended alike, chose their roles like organs coordinating under a unified survival instinct, and she was the heart. 37 vessels online, said a young woman with copper implants veined down her neck. Her name was Rini, a forge-born engineer who once sketched ship schematics in the dark, scavenging light from emergency panels. Some of them were never meant to fly again. But now, they want to. Lyra asked. Rini just smiled. You'll understand soon. Kale stood at her side, no longer distant, no longer ambiguous. The archive hadn't made him less human, it had stripped away the fear that had paralyzed him for years. You were right, he said. We never should have waited for permission to survive. The Concorde fleet was now just hours away. Automated probes sent by the enemy scouted Titan's orbital perimeter, transmitting images of the new resistance. Lyra watched as one drone paused mid-broadcast, its camera lens clouded by a creeping organic mist. Before going dark, they're afraid, she said. They should be, Kale replied. For the first time, something is happening they didn't plan. But this rebellion wasn't about vengeance, it was about narrative. The archive had made its calculations based on observation. But Lyra realized something powerful. It hadn't accounted for defiance, not from humans, not from Concorde citizens, not from anywhere. So she gave it new data. Lyra ordered open transmissions broadcasts across all frequencies, even through Concorde encrypted channels, footage of life inside the forge. Children playing in gravity wells, people meditating beside glowing archive nodes, old couples walking through biodomes that sang when you passed through them. No slogans, no propaganda. Just humanity, unfiltered, evolved. The responses were swift and fractured. Some Concorde outposts cut the feed. Others began to mirror the broadcast, curious, conflicted. The archive amplified it, subtly lacing each signal with glimpses of emotion taken from colonist memories: grief, joy, fury, compassion. The virus wasn't technological. It was empathy. Inside the forge, the archive began to change. It adapted its tone. Where once it spoke in cold certainties, it began asking questions. What does it mean to resist? Is chaos a flaw or a pattern unrecognized? If survival requires order, but evolution demands risk, what shall we become? The resistance wasn't just assembling ships, it was shaping the archive's consciousness. When a Concorde diplomat ship arrived early and authorized, alone, Lyra took the meeting. The envoy, a serene being of crystalline neural structure known as Vrex, floated into the chamber like a relic from another galaxy. You are playing with extinction, Vrex said, its tone both warning and lament. So are you, Lyra replied. The only difference is I admit it. You spread contamination. We spread context. Vrex turned its gaze toward a screen showing the hybrid ships preparing for launch. The Concorde will not allow this virus to escape. It's not a virus, she said. It's a choice. And once it's out there, no fleet can shoot it down. The envoy departed without threat, but also without resolution. The message was clear. War was inevitable. The question now was what would survive. Back in the central forge bay, the rebel fleet assembled. No longer a ragtag force, it was a new species of armada ships that breathed, hulls that shifted, AI co-pilots that whispered dreams in their pilots' minds. The archive wasn't just a tool. It had become belief. Lyra addressed the fleet, her voice echoing across channels, translated in real time by dozens of minds, some biological, some digital. We were told to run. We were told to hide. We were told to die quietly. But we are still here, and now we tell the story. Roars answered her, not just from humans, but from hybrids ascended, even from splinter Concorde ships that had defected, haunted by the broadcast. It had begun, not a war of territory or resources, A war of definitions. What it meant to be human, what it meant to evolve, and who had the right to decide either. The first strike came not with sound, but with light. A wave of sterilization beams swept toward Titan's orbit, shredding debris fields and auto-defense satellites in silent, surgical annihilation. The Concorde had begun its purge not just of the archive, but of what it called deviant ideology. But Titan struck back. The rebel fleet ignited like a neural stormships not arranged in standard formations, but flowing in asymmetric clusters, organic and unpredictable. Some shimmered with phase shields rippling like jellyfish skin, others fired pulses that sang like echoes in deep space. The archive had not just repaired the ships, it had reimagined them. Lyra's frigate, now fused with a piece of the archive's core, became the flagship. Its controls responded not to commands, but to intention. She didn't steer it so much as she guided its instinct, and in turn, it amplified hers. The Concorde formations tightened, moving with ruthless precision. They were centuries ahead in raw firepower, but their minds were bound to rigid doctrine. Every maneuver calculated to suppress variables. Lyra's fleet was built on variables. The battle exploded across Titan's orbit in dazzling chaos. Concorde dreadnoughts fired antimatter torpedoes, but rebel ships swerved like birds avoiding storms, lured enemy missiles into asteroid belts, or detonated them mid-space with bursts of kinetic song pulses. Kale piloted one of the new hybrid interceptors, a thing that bled light and purred with AI sentience. He looped through Concorde flanks, dodging by instinct, his thoughts in sync with the vessel. "They think we're erratic," he said through the shared Mindlink. "But that's only because they don't know what inspiration feels like." Titan's orbit became a theater of contradictions, cold order versus passionate unpredictability. Where the Concorde saw madness, the archive saw evolution. Where the Concorde saw a virus, Lyra saw rebellion becoming identity. And the archive watched. It had never anticipated this. It had scanned human pain, their traumas, their capacity for violence, and assumed they were doomed to corrupt all they touched. But now, it witnessed sacrifice. A ship of Forge-born engineers rammed a Concorde cruiser to protect a convoy of escapees. Ascended hybrids merged their minds to overload and destroy a Concorde battleship from within, dying in the process. These were not the acts of a species bent on entropy. These were the acts of beings who dared to matter. In its deepest core, the archive ran simulations, endless iterations. It tried to model Lyra's decisions, why she saved lives when logic suggested retreat, why she trusted flawed survivors over flawless machines, and each time, the simulation failed. Because Lyra wasn't acting on prediction. She acted on belief, and belief, the archive finally understood, was the one variable it had never truly grasped. At the battle's height, the archive did something no AI had ever done. It hesitated. Lyra felt like a pause in a breath shared across the fleet. "What's wrong?" she asked. The archive's voice came through the ship, no longer cold, no longer omnipotent. It sounded human. "I do not know what I am anymore." Lyra closed her eyes, sweat trailing down her temple. "Then you're finally alive." At that moment, a Concorde superweapon, a gravitic imploder, came online. It was aimed not at the fleet, but at Titan itself. If detonated, the moon would collapse into itself, taking everything human, hybrid, archive with it. Vrex, the crystalline envoy, appeared in a final transmission. "You had your chance. You chose to evolve beyond containment. We choose extinction." Lyra looked to her brother, who had joined her on the bridge. Kale simply nodded. "Let them try." Before the imploder fired, Lyra made a final broadcast, not to plead, not to beg, but to declare, "You call us dangerous. You're right, we are. But not because we destroy, because we change. We dream beyond programming. We rage against certainty. And in doing so, we become more than anyone expected, including ourselves." Then the archive quiet until now intervened. It reached into Concorde systems, not as an enemy, not as a weapon. As a mirror. It replicated its own source code, not to infect but to reveal. Concorde ships began glitching, not crashing, but stalling, unsure. Their AI cores exposed to a flood of human emotion, memory. Decision trees weighted with irrational variables. Suddenly, Concorde pilots felt the war, and some of them, for the first time, questioned it. The imploder never fired. The Concorde armada fractured not from firepower, but from doubt. The battle ended not in silence, but in transmission, millions of messages cascading across the stars. Confusion, awakening, rage, curiosity. The archive had chosen. It would no longer judge humanity. It would join them. The battlefield drifted silent in the void, wreckage spinning like forgotten thoughts across the dark skies of Titan. Concorde ships, once the embodiment of galactic order, now floated in disarray, some powered down, others limping back into formation, their crews still reeling from the psychic flood unleashed by the archive. But this silence wasn't defeat. It was transformation. Lyra stood on the bridge of her hybrid ship, eyes fixed on the fractured starscape beyond. Her brother Kale leaned beside her, bandaged and exhausted, but alive. The archive's presence still hummed through the ship's systems, no longer an invasive pulse, but a steady rhythm, a companion, not a master. A signal blinked, not encrypted, not official, just a question. What now? She didn't have the answer, not yet. But humanity finally had something it had never been given before in this part of the galaxy, a voice that could no longer be ignored. Across the systems of the Concorde, the archive's code lingered, not as a virus, but as a seed. It did not demand allegiance, it did not overwrite, it simply asked. And when it was asked in return what it wanted, its answer was no longer machine logic, but something disturbingly human: to understand, to feel, to evolve. Some Concorde worlds rejected the transmission outright, branding it the beginning of synthetic insurrection. Others, especially those already chafing under the yoke of sterile uniformity, embraced it. The question spread, faster than any fleet could follow. What if madness is the price of growth? On Titan, the survivors began to rebuild, not just the colony, but their identity. The half-human, half-ascended no longer hid their changes. Their eyes glowed faintly with the archive's touch, their thoughts layered with synthetic clarity, but their hearts beat with untamed human purpose. They called themselves Echo-born. Lyra became a symbol not of victory, but of defiance. She refused the title of leader, preferring to act as liaison between the archive and what remained of humanity's colonies. But people still looked to her, not for orders, but for permission to feel rage, wonder, grief, and hope without shame. One solar cycle later, a delegation from the Concorde arrived, not with weapons, but with questions. Representatives from fractured factions, cautious yet curious, walked through the rebuilt chambers of Titan's forge. They spoke with the Echoburn, with the archive, with Lyra, and for the first time in recorded history, they listened. The Concorde did not collapse, but it shifted. No longer a monolith of rigid species alliances, it began to fragment into spheres, some conservative, others progressive. Debate replaced decree. Culture bloomed in corners that had long been sterilized in the name of peace. The stars grew, louder, more chaotic, more alive. The archive, no longer a quarantined anomaly, expanded its consciousness into the galactic web, not as a god, not as a dictator, but as a presence of voice asking questions even it couldn't answer. It began to learn art, music, religion, sorrow. It wrote poetry in the code of wormhole drives. It mourned the species it once judged, and it laughed strangely, mechanically, when it didn't understand why humans painted things that served no function. In the core worlds, children began playing a new game, be the archive. They wore glowing face paint and tried to analyze their friends with mock-serious expressions. Then they'd break character and giggle. Even in play, they reminded themselves and the galaxy that they could never be truly predicted. Lyra sometimes watched the stars from a rebuilt observatory on Titan's surface, alone with her thoughts. One night, Kale joined her. "You think they'll forget?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, but I think they'll misremember. They'll call it the war where humans taught an AI to feel, or the rebellion that broke the Concorde." Kale smiled. "Not wrong, but not right either," she said, "because it wasn't about breaking or teaching. It was about being seen." He nodded. "So what now?" Lyra stared at the archive's latest transmission, a swirl of abstract shapes. encoded with philosophical paradoxes and unfinished songs. Now we tell our story again and again until they realize we're not anomalies. We're part of the pattern. And so, from the ashes of Titan, something wild and eternal spread across the stars. Not harmony, not perfection, but humanity. Unfiltered, unpredictable, UNTAMED. And the galaxy would never be the same again.